Hello, and welcome to this virtual book launch for Sue Lawrence, who was all set to appear tonight, the 26th of March, at Waterstones on Princes Street in Edinburgh. But instead she's self-isolating now that we are in lockdown to flatten this virus curve. I'm Sarah Hunt from the indie publisher Saraband, and we're celebrating the release of Sue's new historical thriller, The Unreliable Death of Lady Grange, which is based on true events in 1730s Scotland. Many of you will know Sue already. Here she is preparing for the launch of her last historical novel, Down to the Sea, at Blackwell's in Edinburgh. As well as writing gripping historical mysteries and thrillers, Sue is a leading cookery writer and broadcaster. She's a former winner of MasterChef, and she was cookery editor for the Sunday Times. And she's been a regular guest with Jay Rayner on BBC Radio 4's Kitchen Cabinet. Before self-isolation, I had stopped in at Sue's home and asked her a few questions about her new book. We've put them together here with some readings and some other elements, so that the book launch can go ahead, even if not exactly as planned. I think we should go right ahead and introduce the book itself. Rachel Cheesley was married for 25 years to Lord Grange, a Scottish Lord Justice Clerk. They'd raised 9 children, but evidently their marriage soured. In 1732, Lord Grange is believed to have arranged to have his wife removed from his life forever by having her abducted and transported to somewhere she could never be found again, to the Monach Isles off the Outer Hebrides, and later to St Kilda, even more remote. Sue has taken the bones of this story and reimagined it from Lady Grange's point of view, though of course very little has survived in the historical records of her own experience. Let's start by asking Sue how she went about researching the book.
When I went down the research route of Lady Grange, fascinated as I was, I actually contacted the National Library of Scotland in George Forth Bridge in Edinburgh, and they gave me a long list of books which she is in. And most of these books are 19th century, some early 20th century, written by men, and usually just being very, very critical of her, that she was a wanton woman, she was a drunkard, she was awful in public. Sometimes she shouted at her husband in a very unladylike manner, and that she was mad because her father had actually killed somebody in broad daylight, and they thought all this was everything that happened to her, well, it was her fault anyway. She deserved everything. The research was absolutely fascinating, mainly because it was all men. There was then another lovely book in the turn of this century, taken more from a woman's perspective, but still not really giving that much away. Samuel Johnson was incredibly scathing about her in his the tour in 1773. He said about St Kilda that if that was a place, a haven for naughty women, then they should all be sent there. So as I say, it was all men's perspective on the whole, and so I wanted to take this from her perspective and from women folk around her. In the novel I talk about things from her daughter's point of view, from her maid's point of view, and just sort of see that it wasn't all her fault. It was somebody else.
Intriguing. Let's have a listen to Sue reading from the prologue. Please forgive a mention of a coffin in these unfortunate times. You'll find out anyway that all is not as it seems.
Mother is not in that coffin, you know. Don't be foolish, Mary. It's your mother's funeral. Of course she's in there. And a rather fine, polished oak your father chose for the cask, I must say. Aunt Jean, Mamma, is not dead. She can't be. She wasn't ill. She never was. Keep your voice down, child. I am not a child, Mary hissed. I am... There was a loud bang as the door flew open and 4 pallbearers entered the room, heading for the coffin. They took up their places at each corner and turned towards the minister, who approached and rested a bony hand upon the wood, rubbing his long fingers up and down as if enhancing the sheen. he raised his head and surveyed the room. There was Lord Grange, whose wife's burial was about to take place. Beside him stood Aunt Jean's husband, Lord Patterson, and the 5 surviving Grange children, all dressed in black, arrayed in descending order of age. Mary, the eldest daughter, stood beside her father's sister. I repeat, Aunt Jean, she was not ill. I can't remember a single time she was ailing. She was strong as an ox. Besides, how is it possible that her waiting woman has also disappeared, vanished into the night?
Lord Grange had faked his wife's funeral. Pretty soon after that, he married his long-time mistress, and there's also evidence that he feared his wife might expose him as a closet Jacobite, which was a treasonable offence at the time. Potential motives for his drastic actions. I'm not giving you spoilers here, this is in the historical record, and Sue's included a note in the book as to where she's speculated or taken liberties with the documented facts. It's extraordinary that someone could simply get rid of his wife so summarily. Obviously, this is an extreme, and it was a crime of kidnap. But in general, the position of women was quite different in the 18th century. I asked Sue about this.
I think it's very interesting looking at Lady Grange's life from the perspective of a woman living in 2020, because things were so different. You married and that was it. Your own status, your own name, you always took on the man's name. Everything was, it disappeared. And you were basically, you belonged to that man. And more interestingly for me in a way, your children also belonged to that man. Lady Grange had 9 children in history. And when this, various events happened, she had absolutely no rights to any of the children. He had them all, even though, of course, he wouldn't be able to look after them. He had to farm them off to his sister. And so I was shocked and horrified by the lack of rights that women had in those days, and especially as a lady. She would have had her servants and everything, of course, but she might not have had anyone else to speak to, because they would have all been also ladies and well-to-do people, and they would have also been under their husband's thumb.
Clearly, Rachel's life would change beyond all recognition. I asked Sue how, for instance, her diet might change once she was taken from her life of relative luxury and found herself on an island.
Interestingly, it wouldn't have been that different to the food that the islanders used to eat up until even the 70s, the 1970s, because there was a lot of seabirds. And even in places like Tiree, west of Harris, Lewis, etc., they ate things like puffins, cormorants, etc., until quite recently. So it wasn't actually that difficult. So they would have had a lot of seabirds, either boiled in soup. Puffins they actually cooked in with their porridge on St Kilda. That was just what they did. And of course, baby gannet, fulmar, auk, guillemot. Seabirds was the big thing. And of course, the seabirds' eggs. They used to have them scrambled or often raw. It wasn't the most appetising of diets, but what else was there to eat?
It's interesting, as we're thinking about our own interrupted food supplies, that Sue said this kind of diet would still have been widespread until such recent times. Well, let's have another reading. Here, we'll briefly meet Katrina, a Monarch Islander.
I stood on the beach, the cold water lapping at my bare feet, looking over the sea at the skerries and the glint of moonlight on the rocks. Even in the dark, this place had the capacity to look strikingly beautiful. I was taking my usual evening stroll over the sand, looking out to sea, hopeful, wishing. It was some 3 months since a boat had managed over to the Monarchs. There had been talk they'd be able to land again soon. I didn't hear this myself, of course. It was only Katrina who told me in our now well-established code of communication. I'd not ventured out in daylight for ages. I'd no wish for the company of others. Only Katrina was my loyal and faithful aid. Dear God, I'd even become used to her vile seabird broths and stews. But I did draw the line at fulmar eggs. Those I could not stomach. I'd read most of the Shakespeare from Bella's trunk and was now becoming agitated as I'd nothing left to read.
Horror. Running out of reading material. Isolation must have been so much more difficult to bear before remote communications were possible. As many people are finding today, music can be an enormous comfort for people who are lonely and missing their loved ones. In the book, Rachel hears Katrina singing a traditional Gaelic lullaby. It provides solace for Rachel as she recalls singing to her own infant children. Sue asked Phyllis Godman, a singer whose repertoire includes traditional Gaelic songs, to give us a special performance of the same lullaby Katrina was singing.
I left my baby lying there, lying there, lying there. I left my baby lying there when I went to gather blaeberries. Hoven, hoven, hurry-oh, hurry-oh, hurry-oh. Hoven, hoven, hurry-oh, when I went to gather blaeberries.
Thank you, Phyllis. Phyllis's son, by the way, is the former Scottish national rugby player Philip Godman. Talented family. After some time on the Monach Isles, Rachel was, again without warning, moved on to an even more remote island.
Even when I consider the hardship I have suffered over the past year and a half, it's nothing compared to the misery I must endure now. It is so much worse in every respect. I'm exceedingly weary of this God-forsaken place with no one for company but a glaikit serving wench. Her bannocks make the memory of Katrina seem as if they were baked by a chef trained at the French court. The only sounds here, apart from the roaring of the wind and the crashing of the waves onto this barren rock, are the shrill squawks of guillemots and solan geese. I sit in this dark, windowless hovel that is now my new home and try to remember my fine life of old.
One big part of Rachel's sense of connection in her loneliness was a difficulty in communicating. Let's hear a bit more about this.
So also when she was travelling over to the west coast of Scotland, where she would have had to wait forever because, there were little boats, they weren't, solid Calmat ferries. It would have taken a long time waiting for the tides, etc. And so all that way, she would have been meeting more and more people who didn't even speak English or Scots, which was in those days more a completely separate language. They were speaking Gaelic, and definitely on the Monach Islands and on St Kilda, there would have been no one who actually she could have communicated with because she didn't speak Gaelic. Her maid, she would have been given a maid on each of the places, and on these islands they would have spoken Gaelic. So what would they have done to communicate? It must have just been gestures. When she was given a bowl of, say, cormorant soup, she might have suggested that she didn't want that ever again, thank you very much, but it would have been all very challenging. Perhaps a minister on one of the islands, either the Monarchs or St Kilda, perhaps a minister's wife, if they were there, might have come over from the mainland, might have been able to communicate with her, but that wasn't a given, and so it was a very, very, very challenging time.
Thanks, Sue. Well, let's have a last reading from the book. Something we can all relate to in our time of self-isolation.
The winter dragged on and on. The storm had lasted nearly a month, by which time most supplies had run out. My claret had finished long ago, but strangely this hadn't affected me as much as it would have in the past. I seemed to have lost my great urge for it. God knows why. Perhaps the corks in my last box were tainted.
Aren't we lucky, by comparison, that we've just had the spring equinox and we can look forward to long, light days for our isolation, and that we can remain connected in so many ways? I'm not sure, though, that the idea of a book launch without wine will ever quite catch on. I hope if you have a glass at home, you'll raise a glass to Sue and wish her well. Sue's book is available to buy from bookshops with delivery services. Please think about your high street shop if you can, and look to buy online. This is the perfect book for our corona lockdown. You can join Sue after this for a Twitter Q&A. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you, Sue, and of course, Phyllis.